Hi everyone, this is Dr. Heather Austin Robillard, and I'm here to talk to you about professional issues that exist in mental health professions, specifically those issues that revolve around ethical practices. Professionals tend to work with a variety of different treatment staff, including psychiatrists, nurses, clinical directors, and other licensed mental health professionals. Each professional has a different set of ethical codes, and they have to follow those in order to remain ethical with their license. Further, on top of that, there are ethical codes that are required for licensure and certification based on state and federal laws that require them and ensure that professionals in the field are following those rules. So you have your license ethical codes, you have your state ethical codes, and then you have your federal ethical codes. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about what is an ethical code, what are their moral principles versus ethical codes, confidentiality, duty to warn, and having dual relationships. So to spend some time talking about ethical codes, it's really important for us to understand what is a code of ethics. A code of ethics is relatively a new part for helping professionals. The first code of ethics were established in 1953, and those were for the American Psychological Association, so for psychologists. The code of ethics describes a nature of one's ethical responsibility. So it's basically a language for people to follow when they come to a fork in the road that has a couple different options for them, and ethics is one way to help them make that decision. A code of ethics supports the mission of an association to ensure that those who practice in the profession are acting according to the desired vision of that governing association. So the organization that your license is under, they want you to behave a certain way when you're dealt with a specific problem. So this just, again, gives you that guide of which way to go when you're faced with a decision. And we'll talk more about those different types of decision where our ethical responsibilities come into play. The code is created to enhance, inform, expand, and improve members of their profession's ability to serve as effectively as possible with the clients that are seeking their help. A code of ethics tends to establish specific principles that define our ethical behavior. It outlines how professionals should interact with students, other professionals, and then the clients and themselves in public as well. Although decisions may not always be clear in the code of ethics, it's a good starting place for when you're making those decisions. It assists members in constructing a professional course of behavior. And finally, if a professional found themselves in a situation where they were reported for improper behavior, the case is reviewed and is based off of their code of ethics of the organization of practice on what their consequences might be. This aids in protecting the professionals from three main groups: the government, professionals, and the public. A basic code of ethics is moral principles. So moral principles help inform the creation of code of ethics. These include the following: justice. We want to be fair, equitable, provide equitable treatment for those that also does not discriminate against certain people. Beneficence is to promote mental health and awareness. Non-malfeasance, which basically means that the professional should do no harm. Autonomy, the professional aims to foster self-determination, which means that we're trying to get our clients to do something for themselves, not do it for them. Fidelity, the professionals will fulfill the responsibility of trust. And veracity, the professional will practice with honesty and truthfulness. Now, each organization has its own unique code of ethics. However, in the mental health field, there are common standards that can be found across all professions. These typically include protecting the client's welfare, avoid doing harm, that's a big one, avoid imposing professional values, emphasize professional qualifications and knowledge of standards, making sure you consult with supervisors or peer counselors, competence to administer or use or interpret assessments, knowledge of the ethical codes and laws, it is the responsibility of the individual in the profession to make sure that they're following the ethical codes of their profession. They can't just say, oh, I didn't know that was an ethical code. They need to be informed of those. And then most importantly is the confidentiality of the clients, one of the most important aspects of our profession. So because this one is the most important, we're going to talk a little bit more about that one. The Code of Ethics says that what is said in here stays in here. So if you've ever gone to a therapist or if you've ever practiced therapy yourself, you know that what is said in the room should remain confidential. The reason of this importance is it aids in reducing the stigma associated with the profession as a whole. It protects the client's privacy, and it tells the client that they can seek help without the fear of repercussions. However, there are situations where confidentiality can be broken, and also there are times where confidentiality might be waived for specific reasons, but we'll first discuss with waiving confidentiality. When a client uses a third-party payer, the client gives consent to have the third-party payer informed of their decisions to seek treatment. This does not mean that all information is released to that third party, just as the client is being seen and possibly the diagnosis. So this is very specific to like insurances. So if your therapist takes your insurance, some of your information is being released to the insurance provider, and that's what you're agreeing to and waiving your confidentiality in that realm. You can also waive this to other medical or mental health professionals. An example of this would be, let's say I have a client and my client also has a psychiatrist that they're seeing for their medication. It's really important for the two of us to work because I might be seeing, I see this client once a week, whereas the psychiatrist sees the client once every 6 weeks. And so that I might be seeing some things that the psychiatrist isn't, and the psychiatrist might be noticing some things that I'm not. So it's important for us to have a conversation. But I can't release any of that information until the client waives their right to confidentiality. So basically they'd have to sign a release of information or an ROI for me to be able to discuss that with the psychiatrist to make sure that everything's being managed appropriately for their medication and for their treatment. There also can be a release of information for families or loved one. This is very common in the case of a minor. When a minor is being seen in treatment, their parents do have a certain amount of leeway on the information that is being provided. Now, however, one little caveat to that is like specifically when I work with adolescents, I don't reveal any information to the parents unless it is suicidal or homicidal ideation. And then I'm more working with the parents on how they can better help their adolescent. And that's really important because if an adolescent feels like everything that's being told to me is going to be told to their parents, they're likely not going to reveal that information. So it really helps me to be able to help that adolescent if I keep that confidentiality. Now, technically, while they're a minor, they have access to their adolescent's medical records. So that is why, again, it's important when you're writing case notes that you're not revealing too much information. That's also important for insurance. You don't want insurance to have a bunch of the information that the client reveals in their case notes. You want them to have as little as needed for insurance purposes. Families or loved one might also have release of information for maybe there's a mental illness and they're the caretaker, or certain information is needed for treatment. But again, a release of information is needed for that, especially if they're not a minor. In all of these situations, the client would be the one to decide who is the one to be contacted, under what circumstances, and the information can be shared. And they also have, at any time, can revoke that release of information. And they can limit what information is being shared with the specific person. So like I've had people where their parents are paying for their sessions, so the only release of information they have is the session dates and the financial part. They don't get any release to anything else. So let's talk about a big one, which is breaking confidentiality. So most of the time when mental health professionals are called up for question in their ethics, it's about breaking confidentiality. And you'll kind of see why when we get to some of the specifics about it. There are times when a mental health professional will need to break confidentiality without the client's permission. And here's some of the reasons that it might happen. There was a landmark case called Tarasoff versus Regents of University of California. And so basically what happened was this was a case in Supreme Court that ruled that mental health professionals have a duty to protect individuals who are being threatened with bodily harm by one of their patients. The protection might mean warning the person who is being threatened directly, notifying the police, and or taking responsible steps to protect the intended victim. So for example, say you have a client that comes in and says, hey, I'm going to shoot up a school. Tarasoff tells us that this is a time where a therapist has the duty to warn and protect by revealing this information to the appropriate authorities in order to protect intended victims. The summary of this case was that University of California, Berkeley was that a graduate student became very obsessed with a female student who he stalked. At the suggestion of a friend, he sought psychological help and began therapy. The therapist recommended having the client committed due to the danger he possessed and let campus police know that the student had told her he was going to kill the female student. The student was briefly detained but released several months later. The student killed the female student. Her parents sued the university and the therapist for not notifying the student or her family of the dangerous threats the student had made in therapy. This case kind of opened up the decision that professionals not only have a duty to protect the client, but also specifically individuals who are in danger. The ruling is upheld in most states, but not all. So as professionals, it's our responsibility to familiarize ourselves with our state's duty to warn and laws of practice. And we'll talk a little bit more about duty to warn in a few slides. Finally, the other reason for breaking confidentiality might include the other factors outside of duty to warn another individual or threats of harm. These include if they're going to harm themselves, like they have suicidal ideation, harm to an identifiable third party. This can include transmitting a disease like HIV, harm to a child or previous victim of a child abuse, harm to an elder or one who is involved in domestic violence, depending on the state. And if the client's file is court ordered, you receive a subpoena. So if you receive a subpoena, you might have to break confidentiality without the client's approval. And then if there's an emergency situation where the information would be necessary. So that could be like, hey, your client has a heart attack in your office and you have to call the ambulance to be able to save your client. Again, that could, then you're basically providing this information. Here is a quick overview of the different states that practiced based on duty to warn. Yellow is when the states are not required to provide duty to warn and protect. So you notice that Nevada, Maine, different ones don't have any requirements for duty to warn. And then duty to protect in permissive, so there's like some laws about it, not very firm ones, are in green. That includes Texas, where I'm at. And duty to protect mandatory, which are in blue. You will note that the state of Texas is a permissive law, and it's one that makes it difficult for professionals to decide how to act in duty to warn situations. So for example, we are not required by law to warn if somebody has homicidal ideation or suicidal ideation. So that means if a client comes to me and says they really want to kill somebody or they really want to kill themselves, I'm not required to report that to anybody. However, basically it just means that confidentiality is more important. However, there are therapists who decide for their own moral ethics that might be something that they break. And they can do that, but they can be sued for breaking confidentiality. So that's really the other dilemma here when it comes to ethics, is you might have your own moral ethics that you have to determine what you're willing to do. And then if you break them, there are consequences to those. Another common code of ethics is concerns for dual relationships. So, a dual relationship is when you have both a professional and a personal relationship with someone. In the mental health professions, this code of ethics clarifies that a professional should not have a non professional relationship with our clients. So, an outside relationship might include befriending a client, accepting gifts from a client, or having sexual or intimate relationships with a client. Preventing a dual relationship becomes increasingly difficult the smaller and smaller the town that you practice in becomes. For example, let's imagine that as a professional, your area of expertise is in food addiction, and you are the only food addiction expert in the town that you live in. The closest other professional in your town is more than 7 hours away. A close friend of yours develops a food addiction and needs treatment, but this would be a dual relationship. We can see from this one example how complicated following a code of ethics is. The concern is also similar to the recovery community. Professionals in the field who are also in recovery may be working with clients that they know from times of use or from times in treatment. It's hard to decide how to navigate those. The other code of ethics that often gets broken is sexual relationships with a client. And that's a big no in our mental health field, and specifically marriage and family therapy. It used to be that you could not have either be a friend or have a date a client or have a sex with a client until you have not been their therapist for 2 years. But recently they changed that to never, you can never have sex with a client. And be thoughtful about why that's important. A lot of people don't understand, but in the therapy relationship, you have so much power and vulnerability that this client is expressing their deepest, darkest thoughts. And so you're kind of in a hierarchical relationship in there, and you know things that they don't know anything about you in that situation. And so it can be very damaging to them, almost like we're taking advantage of them if we are having a sexual relationship with our client. With gifts, you can't accept gifts from clients. My licensing, which is AMFT, has a rule that the gift can't be larger than $50. So we're not talking about gifts like your client draws you a picture. That's not really what we mean by gift. But I've heard of therapists where their client was a very well-to-do person and bought them a car, and that they couldn't accept that gift. So just some things to be thoughtful about. So boundary violations are described in the Code of Ethics that deal with what we share with our clients and whether or not we are sharing it because it can be helpful to them or because it's for our own benefit. It's important that treatment always has the best interest for the client. And at its core, there are times that professionals will face the challenge of deciding what, if anything at all, they should share with their client about themselves or their own life situations. Clients open up a great deal of their personal information to their therapist. They spend a lot of time with this person, and they naturally become curious about who we are and what we're interested in and what our lives are like. Clients may ask us about our marital status, having children, or previous substance abuse, other personal issues that they're just curious about. And usually this curiosity comes from a place of wanting to know if you have the experiences to be helpful to them, and there are plenty of ways to manage this. However, if you do decide to disclose information, you have to think about whether or not you're disclosing because it's truly helpful to the client, or if you are sharing something personal because you want that extra support. So when disclosing information, professionals should ask, would disclosing this information hurt my client? Would disclosing this information actually facilitate trust between me and my client? And would I disclose this information to other clients with a supervisor or a colleague observing? These are important aspects to consider before disclosing information. You can also think if there is another way I can accomplish my goal by sharing something different instead of disclosing this information. This final slide is to kind of just go over the do's and don'ts as a professional when it comes to ethical conduct. So the do's are: we want to be professional, We want to build a support network. If you have support, you can seek out help for others rather than being trying to face that ethical dilemma on your own. That's where most therapists, mental health professionals get in trouble, is when they try to face an ethical dilemma without reaching out to others. Seek your own therapy. There will be times where what you are facing personally can really impact your professional work, and we're not superheroes, so we need to be proactive in dealing with these issues, which are truly important in being ethical providers of the service. And then it's also important to find a way to leave your work at work, not bringing home the emotions that you're dealt with in the room to your home. Some don'ts. Don't cross the line. Know the work and policies and ethical guidelines you're being held to. Don't question other staff. Don't get on teams, and don't talk too much. Ethical guidelines are essential to professional practice. Each mental health professional has their own unique set of codes. However, there are universal codes that tend to promote confidentiality, avoiding boundary violations, and dual relationships, and to seek to protect the client we serve as we help protect the professionals. There, of course, are certain do's and don'ts that professionals can follow to help them be successful in their practice and comply to these ethical standards.